As you continue to follow this pandemic in the news and track the way our experts and political leaders are responding, let me urge skepticism. Here are 3 things to keep in the back of your mind while consuming the news. 1. The projections based on models have been unbelievably, embarrassingly bad. It's like somebody threw a dart at Toledo and hit Bangladesh instead. 2. Don't give social distancing credit for the massive drop in numbers. All of the projections included expectations of full social distancing, and yet they were still astronomically off. We are being gaslighted right now about this. Number 3, and this is more of a framework item. What do you believe the role of government is? Should it protect us from ourselves or protect our liberties and allow us to manage our own risk profiles? We've already seen major reductions in our liberties. Consider some of these questions. Traffic fatalities have dropped significantly during the quarantine, or as I put it, house arrest. Would the government be justified to continue the shutdown in the interest of saving tens of thousands of lives from car accidents? There are lots of reasons to be skeptical of our annual flu numbers, but assuming the 60 to 80,000 annual death rate is actually accurate, why shouldn't the government take similar measures to prevent those? Here's another. Have you ever noticed that every time a crisis occurs, governments ask for more power? They justify it as temporary, generally, but their power levels pretty much never go down to the baseline. It's a ratchet effect. Think of the Patriot Act after 9/11. And indeed, governments all over the world are using this crisis right now as an opportunity to consolidate power and violate people's rights. So with those things in mind, here are some resources and additional voices that are worth paying attention to. And again, all these will be available at closemindedpodcast.com/pandemic. So here are some alternative voices. Dr. Nut Witkowski, he is a biomedical statistician. He worked for 15 years with a leading epidemiologist on the HIV virus. He also spent 20 years heading up the Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design at the Rockefeller University in New York. He is currently CEO of a company that researches treatments for complex diseases. And I've got 2 links to interviews that he gave recently. One is a YouTube interview and a subsequent article described as Stand Up for Your Rights. And he also more recently gave an interview with reporter John Solomon. And I highly encourage you to listen to that. He's got a wildly different take on social distancing, herd immunity, closing everything down from just about anybody else. And he's a really fascinating and articulate guy. Next is Avik Roy. He's a healthcare policy analyst and the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Ben Domenech of The Federalist interviewed Roy about his newly released plan to open the economy responsibly without having a vaccine or testing or a cure for COVID-19. So check out that interview as well. Next is Alex Berenson. He's a former New York Times journalist with an eye for data analysis and spotting BS. His tweet threads over the last few weeks have made for really great and entertaining and edifying reading, so I will link to his Twitter profile. Next is Jonathan Geach. He's a doctor. He posted a very calmly and rationally argued piece to Medium, and that was also signed off by other physicians, and Medium pulled it down because they thought that he disagreed with the value of social distancing. He actually didn't. So they pulled it down, censoring him. And after a couple of tweaks where he went out of his way, although he shouldn't have needed to make it clear that he does agree with social distancing, he reposted it and they have let it stay up. And he also has a more recent article from just yesterday. And those are titled 8 Reasons to End the Lockdown as Soon as Possible. And the newest one is Moving the Goalposts, 4 Reasons It is Safe to Open America. So I'll give you links to those as well as his Twitter handle. Next is Steve Deese. He gave an interview on the Cross Politic Network. He's not an expert in the medical field, but he does have expertise and experience with analyzing models and deconstructing arguments. So he looks at the assumptions behind models and talks about the most rational way to respond to the virus. And I will give the link to that interview as well. Next is the Ron Paul Liberty Report, which is a daily podcast, and there's been a lot of really good content and commentary on the creeping authoritarianism of the state in response to this pandemic. So that's really good. Get an alternative view from what you're seeing on CNN and all the other crap corporate media outlets. Alex Epstein of the Center for Industrial Progress is one of the clearest thinkers on the foundational issues in play with how society should respond to natural disasters, among other things. His niche is looking at issues through the lens of human flourishing. In other words, what will do the most good for the most number of people, and also how to fully understand the myriad of trade-offs that are involved with any public policy. His recent book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, is just outstanding. It's one of the best books of popular level moral philosophy that I've ever read. He is articulate, compassionate, and reasoned. I'm linking here to an interview he gave to podcaster Tom Woods. Epstein is saying things about our response to this virus that I've not heard anywhere else. Highly, highly recommended. And then finally, this is not directly related to COVID-19, but it is an extremely important and stimulating discussion of how an improper understanding of how the world actually works can lead to grossly inaccurate conclusions. And this is a speech that the author Michael Crichton gave back in 2005. And it's just incredibly fascinating. I have been reflecting recently about what has influenced me over the years, about how I understand and interact with the scientific establishment, the media and their bias, the pitfalls of data models, etc. And I remembered reading a speech by Michael Crichton back in college and how much it had stuck with me. So I dug it back up and I reread it, and man, does it hold some incredibly wise and helpful insights for our current times. I realize now that this speech was a significant red pill moment in my intellectual development, especially in how I think about the complexity of the world and how foolishly we believe we can predict outcomes. I highly encourage you to read it. It's entertaining, gripping, and paradigm shifting. There's even a Q&A afterwards where somebody asks him about the next flu pandemic, and this speech is 15 years old. Obviously, I'm not a professional expert on any of these topics, but I would ask you this. What is your frame of mind towards understanding the natural world? Do you have a simplistic, linear expectation for how things work? Are you familiar with the scientific concept of a complex system? Are you aware of the scores of doomsday scenarios, from Y2K and overpopulation to power lines and magnets, that have been promised with total certainty by the corporate press and our scientific institutions that are staffed with so-called experts? Are you aware of how often those predictions came to nothing, zilch, nada? What it comes down to is this. You cannot predict what will happen in a world as immensely complex as ours, and any claim to do so is pure arrogance. You cannot control complex systems. You can only try to manage them with humility. So this speech really sets the stage for understanding that with some pretty stark examples. And really, it's for anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear. So I highly recommend that. One final note about all the content that I've just referenced here. Please don't assume that my guest, Brady, endorses any of these sources or their content. He very well might, or he may not. I did not clear these with him. We have not discussed them. So if any of this offends you, don't attribute it back to him. I'm not speaking for him here. So with that, we'll close up this episode of the Closed-Minded Podcast. If you have enjoyed this content, please consider leaving a rating or review. That goes a long way to getting more eyeballs and ears listening to the show, and that's what I want to do. Really appreciate any feedback that you may want to send my way, and thanks for listening.